Martin Heidegger, The Way Back into the Ground of Metaphysics. Preface. Martin Heidegger was born in 1889. His major work, Sein und Zeit, appeared in 1927, and the many later printings retain the pagination of the original edition, which is also cited in the following essay. Heidegger sometimes cites it as S-U-Z, equivalent to BNT for being and time, even as Kant's Kritik der reinen Vernunft is often cited as KDRV. In 1929, Heidegger published a 17-page lecture, What is Metaphysics?, to which a 9-page postscript was added in 1943. Both have appeared in English, together with 3 other short pieces, and editorial material almost twice the length of the text, 400 pages in all, under the title Existence and Being. In 1949, Heidegger added a 15-page introduction to the 5th printing of his lecture. This introduction is a self-contained essay with a title of its own, and Heidegger attaches the utmost importance to it. He himself selected it for inclusion in the present volume. The essay, not previously available in English, was translated for this purpose, and Heidegger answered questions orally and in writing about the translation of key terms and particularly difficult passages. My rendering of Sein as being, of Seiendes as beings, of Vortellendes Denken as representational thinking, and of Andenkendes Denken as thinking that recalls, to give only a few examples, has his full approval, but he has not gone over the entire text. Every attempt was made to make the English version smooth and yet faithful, and the reader should keep in mind that Heidegger's difficulty is almost legendary, and that like Aristotle and Hegel before him, and like Faulkner in our time, he often deliberately defies the idiomatic vernacular, although at other times he appeals to it. Moreover, the weight of a word is scarcely less important to him than its meaning. The reader who is not put off by what at first seems strange, but reads the essay through, should, even at first reading, understand a good deal. Descartes, writing to Picot, who translated Principia Philosophiae into French, observed, Thus, the whole of philosophy is like a tree. The roots are metaphysics, the trunk is physics, and the branches that issue from the trunk are all the other sciences. Abed ad et ta 9, Roman numeral 9:14. Sticking to this image, we ask, in what soil do the roots of the tree of philosophy have their hold? Out of what ground do the roots, and through them the whole tree, receive their nourishing juices and strength? What element, concealed in the ground, enters and lives in the roots that support and nourish the tree? What is the basis and element of metaphysics? What is metaphysics, viewed from its ground? What is metaphysics itself at bottom? Metaphysics thinks about beings as beings. Wherever the question is asked, what beings as such are in sight. Metaphysical representation owes this sight to the light of being. The light itself, i.e. that which such thinking experiences as light, does not come within the range of metaphysical thinking, for metaphysics always represents beings only as beings. Within this perspective, metaphysical thinking does, of course, inquire about the being which is the source and originator of this light, but the light itself is considered sufficiently illuminated as soon as we recognize that we look through it whenever we look at beings. In whatever manner beings are interpreted, whether as spirit, after the fashion of spiritualism, or as matter and force after the fashion of materialism, or as becoming life, or idea, will, substance, subject, or energia, or as the eternal recurrence of the same events. Every time beings as beings appear in the light of being. Wherever metaphysics represents beings, being has entered into the light. Being has arrived in a state of unconcealedness. But whether and how being itself evolves, but whether and how being itself involves such unconcealedness, whether and how it manifests itself in and as metaphysics, remains obscure. Being in its revelatory essence, i.e., in its truth, it is not recalled. Nevertheless, when metaphysics gives answers to its question concerning beings as such, metaphysics speaks out of the unnoticed revealedness of being. The truth of being may thus be called the ground in which metaphysics, as the root of the tree of philosophy, is kept, and from which it is nourished. Because metaphysics inquires about beings as beings, it remains concerned with beings and does not devote itself to being as being. As the root of the tree, it sends all nourishment and all strength into the trunk and its branches. The root branches out in the soil to enable the tree to grow out of the ground and thus to leave it. The tree of philosophy grows out of the soil in which metaphysics is rooted. The ground is the element in which the root of the tree lives, but the growth of the tree is never able to absorb this soil in such a way that it disappears in the tree as part of the tree. Instead, the roots, down to the subtlest tendrils, lose themselves in the soil. The ground is ground for the roots, and in the ground the roots forget themselves for the sake of the tree. The roots still belong to the tree even when they abandon themselves, after a fashion, to the element of the soil. They squander themselves and their element on the tree. As roots they do not devote themselves to the soil, at least not as if it were their life to grow only into this element and to spread out in it. Presumably the element would not be the same element either if the roots did not live in it. Presumably the element would not be the same element either if the roots did not live in it. Metaphysics, insofar as it always represents only beings as beings, does not recall being itself. Philosophy does not concentrate on its ground. It always leaves its ground, leaves it by means of metaphysics, and yet it never escapes its ground. Insofar as a thinker sets out to experience the ground of metaphysics, insofar as he attempts to recall the truth of being itself instead of merely representing beings as beings, his thinking has, in a sense, left metaphysics. From the point of view of metaphysics, such thinking goes back into the ground of metaphysics. But what still appears as ground from this point of view is presumably something else, once it is experienced in its own terms, something as yet unsaid, according to which the essence of metaphysics, too, is something else and not metaphysics. Such thinking, which recalls the truth of being, is no longer satisfied with mere metaphysics, to be sure, but it does not oppose and think against metaphysics either. To return to our image, it does not tear up the root of philosophy. It tills the ground and ploughs the soil for this root. Metaphysics remains the basis of philosophy. The basis of thinking, however, it does not reach. When we think of the truth of being, metaphysics is overcome. We can no longer accept the claim of metaphysics that it takes care of the fundamental involvement in being, and that it decisively determines all relations to beings as such. But this overcoming of metaphysics does not abolish metaphysics. As long as man remains the animal rationale, he is also the animal metaphysicum. As long as man understands himself as the rational animal, metaphysics belongs, as Kant said, to the nature of man. But if our thinking should succeed in its efforts to go back into the ground of metaphysics, it might well help to bring about a change in human nature, accompanied by a transformation of metaphysics. If, as we unfold the question concerning the truth of being, we speak of overcoming metaphysics, this means recalling being itself. Such recalling goes beyond the tradition of forgetting the ground of the root of philosophy. The thinking attempted in Being in Time, 1927, sets out on the way to prepare an overcoming of metaphysics, so understood. That, however, which prompts such thinking can only be that which is to be recalled. That being itself and how being itself concerns our thinking does not depend on our thinking alone. That being itself and the manner in which that being itself and how being itself concerns our thinking does not depend on our thinking alone, that being itself and the manner in which being itself strikes a man's thinking, that rouses his thinking and stirs it to rise from being itself to respond and correspond to being as such. Why, however, should such an overcoming of metaphysics be necessary? Is the point merely to underpin that discipline of philosophy which was the root hitherto, or to supplant it with yet more basic discipline? It is a question of changing with the philosopher. Is it a question of changing the philosophic system of instruction? No. Or are we trying to go back into the ground of metaphysics in order to uncover a hitherto overlooked presupposition of philosophy, and thereby to show that philosophy does not yet stand on an unshakable foundation, and therefore cannot yet be the absolute science? No. It is something else that is at stake with the arrival of the truth of being or its failure to arrive. It is neither the state of philosophy nor philosophy itself alone, but rather the proximity or remoteness of that from which philosophy, insofar as it means the representation of beings as such, receives its nature and its necessity. What is to be decided is nothing less than this: can being itself, out of its own unique truth, bring about its involvement in human nature, or shall metaphysics, which turns its back to its ground, prevent further that the involvement of being in man may generate a radiance out of the very essence of this involvement itself, a radiance which might lead man to belong to being? In its answers to the question concerning beings as such, metaphysics operates with a prior conception of being. It speaks of being necessarily and hence continually, but metaphysics does not induce being itself to speak, for metaphysics does not recall being in its truth, nor does it recall truth as unconcealedness, nor does it recall the nature of unconcealedness. To metaphysics, the nature of truth always appears only in the derivative form of the truth of knowledge and the truth of propositions which formulate our knowledge. Unconcealedness, however, might be prior to all truth in the sense of veritas. Something might be the word that offers a hitherto unnoticed hint concerning the nature of esse, which has not yet been recalled. If this should be so, then the representational thinking of metaphysics could certainly never reach this nature of truth. However zealously it might devote itself to the historical studies of pre-Socratic philosophy. For what is at stake here is not some renaissance of pre-Socratic thinking, and any such attempt would be vain and absurd. What is wanted is rather some regard for the arrival of hitherto unexpressed nature of the hitherto unexpressed nature of unconcealedness. For it is in this form that being has announced itself. Meanwhile, the truth of being has remained concealed from metaphysics during its long history from Anaximander to Nietzsche. Why does metaphysics not recall it? Is the failure to recall it merely a function of some kinds of metaphysical thinking, or is it an essential feature of the fate of metaphysics that its own ground eludes it, because in the rise of unconcealedness its very core, namely concealedness, stays away in favor of the unconcealed, which appears in the form of beings? Metaphysics, however, speaks continually, and in the most veracious ways, of being. Metaphysics gives, and seems to confirm, the appearance that it asks and answers the question concerning being. In fact, metaphysics never answers the question concerning the truth of being, for it never asks this question. Metaphysics does not ask this question because it thinks of being only by representing beings as beings. It means all beings as a whole, although it speaks of being. It refers to being and means beings as beings. From its beginning to its completion, the propositions of metaphysics have been strangely involved in a persistent confusion of beings and being. This confusion, to be sure, must be considered an event, and not a mere mistake. It cannot by any means be charged to a mere negligence of thought or carelessness of expression. Owing to this persistent confusion, the claim that metaphysics poses the question of being lands us in utter error. Due to the manner in which it thinks of beings, metaphysics almost seems to be, without knowing it, the barrier which keeps man from the original involvement of being in human nature. What if the absence of this involvement and the oblivion of this absence determine the entire modern age? What if the absence of being abandoned man more and more exclusively to beings, leaving him forsaken and far from any involvement of being in his nature, while this forsakenness itself remained veiled? What if this were the case, and had been the case for a long time now? What if there were signs that this oblivion will become still more decisive in the future? Would there still be an occasion for a thoughtful person to give himself arrogant airs in view of this fateful withdrawal with which being presents us? Would there still be an occasion, if this should be our situation, to deceive ourselves with pleasant phantasms, and to indulge of all things in an artificially induced elation? If the oblivion of being which has been described here should be real, would there not be an occasion enough for a thinker who recalls being to experience a genuine horror? What more can his thinking do than to endure and dread its fateful withdrawal, while first of all facing up to the oblivion of being? But how could thought achieve this as long as its faithfully granted dread seems to it no more than a mood of depression? What does such dread, which is fated by being, have to do with psychology or psychoanalysis? Suppose that the overcoming of metaphysics involved the endeavor to commence with a regard for the oblivion of being, the attempt to learn to develop such a regard in order to experience this oblivion and to absorb this experience into the involvement of being in man, and to preserve it there. Then, in the distress of the oblivion of being, the question, what is metaphysics, might well become the most necessary necessity for thought. Thus everything depends on this, that our thinking should become more thoughtful in its season. This is achieved when our thinking, instead of implementing a higher degree of exertion, is directed toward a different point of origin. The thinking which is posited by beings as such, and therefore representational and illuminating in that way, must be supplanted by a different kind of thinking, which is brought to pass by being itself, and therefore responsive to being. All attempts are futile which seek to make representational thinking which remains metaphysical, and only metaphysical, effective and useful for immediate action in everyday public life. The more thoughtful our thinking becomes, and the more adequate it is to the involvement of being in it, the purer our thinking will stand, eo ipso, in the one action appropriate to it, recalling what is meant for it, and thus, in a sense, what is already meant. But who still recalls what is meant? One makes inventions to lead our thinking on the way on which it might find the involvement of the truth of being in human nature, to open up a path for our thinking on which it may recall being itself in its truth. To do that, the thinking attempted in being and time is on its way. On this way, that is, in the service of the question concerning the truth of being, it becomes necessary to stop and think about human nature. For the experience of the oblivion of being, which is not specifically mentioned because it still had to be demonstrated, involves the crucial conjecture that in the view of the unconcealedness of being, the involvement of being in human nature is an essential feature of being. But how could this conjecture, which is experienced here, become an explicit question before every attempt had been made to liberate the determination of human nature from the concept of subjectivity and from the concept of the animal rationale, to characterize with a single term both the involvement of being in human nature and the essential relation of man to the openness there of being as such? The name of being there, design, was chosen for that sphere of being in which man stands as man. This term was employed even though in metaphysics it is used interchangeably with existentia. Actually, reality and objectivity, although this metaphysical usage is further supported by the common German expression menschliches Dasein. Any attempt, therefore, Dasein. Any attempt, therefore, to rethink being and time is thwarted as long as one is satisfied with the observation that, in this study, the term being there is used in place of consciousness. as if this were simply a matter of using different words, as if it were not the one and only thing at stake here, namely, to get men to think about the involvement of being in human nature, and thus, from our point of view, to present first of all an experience of human nature which may prove sufficient to direct our inquiry. The term being there neither takes the place of the term consciousness, nor does the object designated as being there take the place of what we think of when we speak of consciousness. Being there names that which should first of all be experienced, and subsequently thought of as a place, namely, the location of the truth of being. What the term being there means throughout the treatise on being and time is indicated immediately, page 42, by its introductory key sentence. The essence of being there lies in its existence. Thus, Wesen, thus, des Seins, light in seiner existenz. To be sure, in the language of metaphysics, the word existence is a synonym of being there. Both refer to the reality of anything at all that is real, from God to a grain of sand. As long, therefore, as the quoted sentence is understood only superficially, the difficulty is merely transferred from one word to another, from being there to existence. In B&T, the term existence is used exclusively for the being of man. Once existence is understood rightly, the essence of being there can be recalled. In its openness, being itself manifests and conceals itself, yields itself, and withdraws. At the same time, the truth of being does not exhaust itself in being there, nor can it by any means simply be identified with it after the fashion of the metaphysical proposition. All objectivity is as such also subjectivity. What does existence mean in B&T? The word designates a mode of being, specifically the being of those beings who stand open for the openness of being in which they stand, by standing it. This standing it, this enduring, is experienced under the name of care. The ecstatic essence of being there is approached by way of care, and conversely, care is experienced adequately only in its ecstatic essence. Standing it, experienced in this manner, is the essence of the ecstasis, which must be grasped by thought. The ecstatic essence of existence is therefore still understood inadequately as long as one thinks of it as merely standing out, while interpreting the out meaning away from the inside of an immanence of consciousness and spirit. For in this manner, existence would still be understood in terms of subjectivity and substance, while in fact the out ought to be understood in terms of the openness of being itself. The stasis of the ecstatic consists, strangely as it may sound, in standing. The stasis of the ecstatic consists, strange as it may sound, in standing in the out, and there of unconcealedness in which being itself is present. What is meant by existence in the context of an inquiry that is prompted by and directed toward the truth of being can be most beautifully designated by the word instancy. Instandigkeit. Instandigkeit. We must think at the same time, however, of standing in the openness of being and of enduring, and outstanding this standing in, care, and of outbraving the utmost, being toward death, for it is only together that they constitute the full essence of existence. The being that exists is man. Man alone exists. Rocks are, but they do not exist. Trees are, but they do not exist. Horses are, but they do not exist. Angels are, but they do not exist. God is, but he does not exist. The proposition, man alone exists, does not mean by any means that man alone is a real being while other beings are unreal and mere appearances or human ideas. The proposition man exists means man is that being whose being is distinguished by the open standing in the unconcealedness of being, from being, in being. The existential nature of man is the reason why man can represent beings as such, and why he can be conscious of them. All consciousness presupposes ecstatically understood existence as the essentia of man. Essentia meaning that as which man is present insofar as he is man. But consciousness does not itself create the openness of beings, nor is it consciousness that makes it possible for man to stand open for beings. Whither and whence and in what free dimension could the intentionality of consciousness move? If instancy were not the essence of man in the first instance, what else could be the meaning, if anybody has ever seriously thought about this, of the word sein in the German words Bewusstsein, consciousness, literally being conscious, and Selbstbewusstsein, self-consciousness, if it did not designate the essential nature of that which is in the mode of existence. To be a self is admittedly one feature of the nature of that being which exists, but existence does not consist in being a self, nor can it be defined in such terms. We are faced with the fact that metaphysical thinking understands man's selfhood in terms of substance, and at bottom, this amounts to the same in terms of the subject. It is for this reason that the first way which leads away from metaphysical conception, from metaphysics to the ecstatic existential nature of man, must lead through the metaphysical conception of human selfhood. B&T 63 and 64. The question concerning existence, however, is always subservient to that question which is nothing less than the only question of thought. This question, yet to be unfolded, concerns the truth of being as the concealed ground of all metaphysics. For this reason, the treatise, which sought to point the way back into the ground of metaphysics, did not bear the title Existence and Time, nor Consciousness and Time, but Being and Time. Nor can this one title be understood as if it were parallel to the customary juxtapositions of being and becoming, being and seeming, being and thinking, or being and ought. For all these cases, being is limited, as if becoming, seeming, thinking, and ought do not belong to being, although it is obvious that they are not nothing, and thus belong to being. In being and time, being is not something other than time. Time is called the first name of the truth of being, and this truth is the presence of being, and thus being itself. But why time and being? By recalling the beginnings of history, when being unveiled itself in the thinking of the Greeks, it can be shown that the Greeks from the very beginning experienced the being of beings as the presence of the present. When we translate Yelpoi as being, our translation is linguistically correct. Yet we merely substitute one set of sounds for another. As soon as we examine ourselves, it becomes obvious that we neither think properly, as it were, in Greek, nor have in mind a correspondingly clear and univocal concept when we speak of being. What then are we saying when instead of blah we say being, and instead of being blah and esse? We are saying nothing. The Greek, Latin, and German word all remain equally obtuse. As long as we adhere to the customary usage, we merely betray ourselves as the pacemakers of the greatest thoughtlessness which has ever gained currency in human thought, and which has remained dominant until this moment. This rule, however, means to be present, anwesend. This verb form, in place of the idiomatic anwesend sein, is Heidegger's neology. The true being of this being in present, thus Wesen, Dieses, anwesend, is deeply concealed in the earliest names of being. But for us, as rule and means this first of all. In being present, there moves unrecognized and concealed present time and duration. In one word, time, being as such, is thus unconcealed owing to time. Thus time points to the unconcealedness, i.e. the truth of being, but the time of which we should think here is not experienced through the changeful career of beings. Time is evidently an altogether different nature. Time is evidently of an altogether different nature, which neither has been recalled by way of the time concept of metaphysics, nor ever can be recalled in this way. Thus, time becomes the first name, which is yet to be heeded, of the truth of being, which is yet to be experienced. A concealed hint of time speaks not only out of the earliest metaphysical names of being, but also out of its last name, which is the eternal recurrence of the same events. Through the entire epoch of metaphysics, time is decisively present in the history of being, without being recognized or thought about. To this time, space is neither coordinated nor merely subordinated. Suppose one attempts to make a transition from the representation of beings as such to recalling the truth of being. Such an attempt, which starts from this representation, must still represent in a certain sense the truth of being too. and any such representation must of necessity be heterogeneous, and any such, and ultimately, insofar as it is a representation, inadequate for that which is to be thought. This relation, which comes out of metaphysics and tries to enter into the involvement of truth of being in human nature, is called understanding. But here understanding is viewed at the same time from the point of view of the unconcealedness of being. Understanding is a project, thrust forth and ecstatic, which means that it stands in the sphere of the open, the sphere which opens up as we project in order that something, being in this case, may prove itself as something, in this case, being as itself in its unconcealedness. It is called the sense, cf. B&T, page 151. The sense of being and the truth of being mean the same. Let us suppose that time belongs to the truth of being in a way that is still concealed, that every project that holds open the truth of being, representing a way of understanding being, must look out into time as the horizon of any possible understanding of being. Cf. B&T 31-34 and 68. The preface to Being and Time on the first page of the treatise ends with these sentences. To furnish a concrete elaboration of the question concerning the sense of being is the intention of the following treatise. The interpretation of time as the horizon of every possible attempt to understand being is its provisional goal. All the philosophy has fallen into the oblivion of being, which has at the same time become and remained the faithful demand on thought in B&T, and philosophy could hardly have given a clearer demonstration of the power of this oblivion of being than it has furnished us by the somnambulistic assurance with which it has passed by the real and only question of B&T. What is at stake here is, therefore, not a series of misunderstandings of a book, but our abandonment by being. Metaphysics states what beings are as beings. It offers a little statement about the oeuvre, beings. The later title, Ontology, characterizes its nature, provided, of course, that we understand it in accordance with its true significance, and not through its narrow scholastic meaning. Metaphysics moves in the sphere of the relative. It deals with beings as beings. In this manner, Metaphysics always represents beings as such in their totality. It deals with the beingness of beings, but the metaphysics represents beings. But the metaphysics represents the beingness of beings, die Scheinheit des Seinden, in a twofold manner. In the first place, the totality of beings as such, with an eye to their most universal traits, but at the same time also the totality of beings as such in the sense of the highest and therefore divine being in the metaphysics of Aristotle. The unconcealedness of beings as such has specifically developed in this twofold manner. Cf. Met. E.K. Because metaphysics represents beings as beings, it is, two in one, the truth of beings in their universality, and the highest being. According to its nature, it is at the same time ontology, in the narrower sense, and theology. This ontotheological nature of philosophy proper is, no doubt, due to the way in which the earth opens up in it, namely as earth. Thus, the theological character of ontology is not merely due to the fact that Greek metaphysics was later taken up and transformed by the ecclesiastic theology of Christianity. Rather, it is due to the manner in which beings as beings have from the very beginning disconcealed themselves. It was this unconcealedness of beings that provided the possibility for Christian theology to take possession of Greek philosophy, whether for better or for worse, may be decided by the theologians on the basis of their experience of what is Christian. Only then, only they, should keep in mind what is written in the first epistle of Paul, the apostle to the Corinthians. Has not God let the wisdom of this world become foolishness? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20. The wisdom of this world, however, is that which, according to chapter 1, verse 22, the Greeks seek. Aristotle even calls the philosophy proper quite specifically, what is sought? Will Christian theology make up its mind one day to take seriously the word of the apostle, and thus also the conception of philosophy as foolishness? As the truth of beings as such, metaphysics has a twofold character. The reason for this twofoldness, however, let alone its origin, remains unknown to metaphysics, and this is no accident, nor due to mere neglect. Metaphysics has this twofold character because it is what it is, the representation of beings as beings. Metaphysics has no choice. Being metaphysics, it is by its very nature excluded from the experience of being, for it always represents beings only with an eye to what of being has already manifested itself as beings. But metaphysics never pays attention to what has concealed itself in this very insofar as it became unconcealed. Thus the time came when it became necessary to make a fresh attempt to grasp by thought what precisely is said when we speak of or use the word being. Accordingly, the question concerning the was reintroduced into human thinking, cf. B&T, Preface, but this reintroduction is no mere repetition of the Platonic Aristotelian question. Instead it asks about that which conceals itself in the Metaphysics is founded upon that which conceals itself here as long as metaphysics studies the attempt to inquire back into what conceals itself here seeks, from the point of view of metaphysics, the fundament of ontology. Therefore, this attempt is called, in Being and Time, fundamental ontology. Fundamental ontology. Yet, this title, like any title, is soon seen to be inappropriate. From the point of view of metaphysics, to be sure, it says something that is correct, but precisely for that reason it is misleading. For what matters is success in the transition from metaphysics to recalling the truth of being. As long as this thinking calls itself fundamental ontology, it blocks and obscures its own way with this title. But what the title fundamental ontology suggests is, of course, that the attempt to recall the truth of being, and not, like all ontology, the truth of beings is itself, saying that it is called fundamental ontology, still a kind of ontology. In fact, the attempt to recall the truth of being sets out on the way back into the ground of metaphysics, and with its first step, it immediately leaves the realm of all ontology. On the other hand, every philosophy which revolves around an indirect or indirect conception of transcendence remains of necessity essentially an ontology, whether it achieves the new foundation of ontology or whether it assures us that it repudiates ontology as a conceptual freezing of experience. Coming up from the ancient custom of representing beings as such, the very thinking that attempted to recall the truth of being became entangled in these customary conceptions. Under these circumstances, it would seem that both for preliminary orientation and in order to prepare the transition from representational thinking to a new kind of thinking recalls, thus undenkende denken, that nothing could be more necessary than the question, what is metaphysics? The unfolding of this question in the following lecture culminates in another question. That is called the basic question of metaphysics. Why is there any being at all, and not rather nothing? Meanwhile, since this lecture was first published in 1929, to be sure, people have talked back and forth a great deal about dread and the nothing, both of which are spoken of in this lecture. But one has never yet deigned to ask oneself why a lecture which moves from thinking of the truth of being to the nothing, and then tries from there to think into the nature of metaphysics, should claim that this question is the basic question of metaphysics. How can an attentive reader help feeling on the tip of his tongue an objection which is far more weighty than all protests against dread and the nothing? The final question provokes the objection that an inquiry which attempts to recall being by way of the nothing returns in the end to a question concerning beings. On top of that, the question even proceeds in the customary manner of metaphysics by beginning with a casual why. To this extent, then, the attempt to recall being is repudiated in favor of representational knowledge of beings on the basis of beings. And to make matters still worse, the final question is obviously the question which the metaphysician Leibniz posed in his Principes de la Nature et de la Grace. Pourquoi il y a plutôt quelque chose que rien? Op-ed Gear Tom Roman numeral 6, 602N7. Does the lecture then fall short of its intention? After all, this would be quite possible, in view of the difficulty of effecting a transition from metaphysics to another kind of thinking. Does the lecture end up by asking Leibniz's metaphysical question about the supreme cause of all things that have being? Why then is Leibniz's name not mentioned, as decency would seem to require? Or is the question asked in an altogether different sense? If it does not concern itself with beings and inquire about their first cause among all beings, then the question must begin from that which is not a being. And this is precisely what the question names, and it capitalizes the word, the nothing. This is the sole topic of the lecture. The demand seems obvious that the end of the lecture should be thought through, for once, in its own perspective, which determines the whole lecture. What has been called the basic question of metaphysics would then have to be understood and asked in terms of fundamental ontology, as the question that comes out of the ground of metaphysics, and as the question about this ground. But if we grant this lecture that in the end it thinks in the direction of its own distinctive concern, how are we to understand this question? The question is, why is there any being at all, and not rather nothing? Suppose that we do not remain within metaphysics to ask metaphysically in the customary manner. Suppose we recall the truth of being out of the nature and the truth of metaphysics. Then this might be asked as well. How did it come about that beings take precedence everywhere and lay claim to every is, while that which is not a being is understood as nothing, though it is being itself and remains forgotten? How did it come about that with being it really is nothing, and that the nothing really is not? Is it perhaps from this that the as yet unshaken presumption has entered into all metaphysics that being may simply be taken for granted, and that nothing is therefore made more easily than beings? That is indeed the situation regarding being and nothing. If it were different, then Leibniz could not have said in the same place, by way of an explanation, car le rein est plus simple et plus facile que quelque chose, for the nothing is simpler and easier than anything. What is more enigmatic, that beings are, or that being is? Or does even this reflection fail to bring us close to that enigma which has occurred with the being of beings? Whatever the answer may be, the time should have ripened meanwhile for thinking through the lecture. What is metaphysics, which has been subjected to so many attacks from its end, for want from its end, and not from an imaginary end?